Hey guys, welcome to Arcran's Arcanum. I'm Arcran, and today we're going to be talking about magic weapons and how you can make interesting ones for your 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons campaign. By the end of this video, you're going to be armed with the tools to make magic weapons that'll make even the angriest of barbarians smile. Before we get to that though, I want to talk about some common pitfalls that I see that keep magic weapons from reaching their full potential. The first common pitfall shows up a lot in low-level games, and that's magic weapons that are just a bonus to hit and a bonus to damage. And while these weapons aren't going to break your game or anything like that, they're boring. There's not really much difference between attacking with a normal sword and a +1 sword, except that the +1 sword does a little bit more damage and hits a little more often. We want our magic weapons to feel magic, feel special, give your players new tools and new options. A bonus to damage isn't bad, it just shouldn't be the only thing that a magic weapon provides. The next common pitfall I see all the time in magic weapons, and that's granting a ton of combat spells or other abilities that use your action. A good example is your players get the Fiery Sword of Flaming Doom, and now they can use it to catch Burning Hand, Scorching Ray, and Fireball a few times per day. The problem with this is this means your players can't use their action to attack and actually use the weapon. Instead, they're casting a spell, and generally the players that pick the type of classes that will appreciate magic weapons want to actually be attacking and swinging their sword and turning their enemies into chunky salsa. The other issue with this is it can be hard to balance these spells around the rest of your party. If the spells are too weak, the players are never going to use them. If they're too strong, the actual spellcasters in your party might feel overshadowed by a magic weapon, and that's not a good feeling. There are good ways to grant things that are like spells but not actually spells to your players, and we'll cover that later in the video. The last common pitfall I see isn't as egregious as the others, but will really slow down the combat in your game. A lot of poison-themed magic weapons and things like that are guilty of this, where every single attack, the target has to make a saving throw. Your player's going to roll to hit, wait for a result, you roll a saving throw, player has to wait for that result too, and then they get to roll damage, which means that every single round, every single attack, there's an extra step which is going to bog down your combat and slow down your game. In general, your weapon should roll to hit and then roll damage just like a normal weapon. Having a few times per day saving throw ability, that's fine, but every single attack forcing a saving throw is not a good idea. Now that we've covered what not to do, let's go over the 3 steps we're going to follow for making useful, interesting magic weapons. Step 1 is just going to be giving the weapon a buff. It should be better than a non-magical weapon, and whatever you have that makes it better should work all the time. Step 2 is going to be making your weapon flexible. A good magic weapon should give your players new options and tools in combat that they don't normally have access to. Step 3 is similar, where we're just going to give the weapon out of combat utility. Your players should have a good reason to draw their weapon outside of combat and hopefully use it in other scenarios. Let's start with step 1, buffing your weapon and making it better than non-magical alternatives. This is a little bit of a tricky step because if we make it too powerful, we don't leave much room for the other 2 steps to give interesting, powerful skills. So I'm going to go through the different options you have for making your weapon better than a non-magical weapon, and kind of rank them in terms of how much of a boost you can expect, and give you some recommendations on what you might want to do. The first type of buff, and probably the weakest, is going to be anything that doesn't directly impact the damage of the weapon. This could be something like a bow providing its own arrows, or a dagger that makes you resistant to poison. Both of these are useful effects, but they don't directly impact the damage of the weapon, so they're not really that powerful. This is great for weapons that you want to have a lot of utility, or if it's meant as a weak magic item for a very low level party. The rest of the buffs we're going to talk about are a bit more powerful because they actually impact the damage the weapon deals. The first of these is extra damage on a critical hit. Because in theory, only a 20th of attacks are a crit, you can have a huge bonus here and it doesn't have a huge impact on the damage. For example, 4d6 extra damage on a critical hit comes out to less than 1 more damage per attack on average. Because of this, it's not a huge power spike, but it makes one of the best parts of the game even better. This is an excellent buff for low-level parties, or again, if you're just trying to not make that powerful of a magic weapon. The next tier of buff is going to be anything that provides extra damage on every single attack. And this is where dealing a little bit of fire damage each attack and things like that comes in. This is my recommended buff because it's easy to tell what kind of bonus your players are getting out of this. If you're just giving a flat value to each attack, that's how much more damage they're going to do. If you're giving a damage dice bonus, it's going to be approximately what's on the screen right now. Because of this, it's a bit easier to balance around these weapons because you know what you're getting. In general, I would also recommend using a damage dice over a flat bonus because it makes it really clear the damage the weapon is contributing, and if your players are rolling more dice, it's a lot more obvious that there's something different. In general, when deciding how much of a damage bump you want to give your weapon, about 3 points of damage per attack per every 5 levels is a decent approximation. Just as a general note, the type of your bonus damage does matter. In general, poison damage is a little bit weaker because a lot of creatures are resistant or immune to that, while on the other end, force, radiant, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage is stronger because not many creatures are resistant to those. There's 2 ways to balance this. One is if you're using poison damage, make it do a bit more, while the other types maybe do a bit less. This is a good quick and dirty way to balance it, but isn't perfect. The better way to balance this is to just be conscious of what your party's going to be fighting. If you're going to be fighting a lot of devils that are immune to fire damage, don't give your fighter a flaming sword. This is a really good way to do it, but it does require foresight, so it might be hard to pull off. The final common type of buff is a bonus to hit. The problem with this is that it's harder to balance around because it doesn't cleanly convert to a specific damage value. You can somewhat treat a +1 to hit as +2 damage, but that's not perfect. It fluctuates depending on the target's AC as well as how hard your characters hit. In addition, it's kind of an invisible buff. It's not clear when the magic weapon is turning a miss into a hit, so your players don't notice that it's doing anything. You want your magic weapon to have a very clear effect. Because of this, I like to use damage value bonuses rather than to hit bonuses. With that, step 1 is done. You have a couple good options for how you can give a buff to your weapon and make it better than a non-magical weapon. Now we want to move on to step 2, which is giving our weapon some combat utility. When we do this, we want to keep one thing in mind. Whatever utility we add, it should not impact our player's ability to take the attack action because that's what weapons are for. This means that whatever utility we add needs to either be built into the attack action or take a bonus action. You have a lot of different ways you can do this, so I'm going to go over some broad options and hopefully that will spark some inspiration in you. The first example we're going to talk about is anything that would help the players reach a part of the battlefield that normally they couldn't. Especially for melee characters, this is really helpful because normally melee characters have the hardest time getting to the point where their weapon is effective. This can take the form of letting them make ranged attacks when normally they couldn't, so maybe they're shooting energy blasts out of their sword and you can attack someone within 60 feet a few times per day. On the other hand, you might give them something that boosts their actual movement. Maybe you just give them a short-range teleport as a bonus action like Misty Step. Whatever it is, you want to focus either on manipulating the weapon's range or manipulating how the player can move. And these can be as simple or complicated as you want, but the end goal is letting your player get somewhere and influence the fight when normally they wouldn't be able to do it. Another good example of some combat utility we can introduce through our magic weapon is battlefield control. You're probably most familiar with this through spellcasters and things like Web and Grease, where the whole area of the battlefield gets locked down and it's really difficult to get through. Martial characters don't really get to play with these toys much, so it's a good thing to introduce through our magic weapon. It's also really easy to build into the attack action. A good example is, a few times per day, when you take the attack action, you can put a few squares of rough terrain near you. If you're going for a more powerful effect, maybe you're placing blocking terrain instead, or a weaker replica of a spell like Wall of Fire. I really like this option for martial characters because it gives them a tool they really don't get to mess with, and it's easily integrated into their attack action. Our final method of introducing some combat utility is going to come through secondary effects of attacks. This means that a few times per day, after your player has already hit with an attack, they can cause something a little bit extra. This is normally going to be a save against a condition or something like that. A good example would be if you have a magical sword of darkness, you can try to blind a target and they'll have to make a constitution save or be blinded until the end of your next turn. Another example could be something that doesn't involve conditions at all, and maybe your anti-magic sword automatically can dispel a level 1 effect 2 or 3 times per day. If you're looking for inspiration, I encourage you to look at the Battle Master maneuvers in the core book, as well as all the different smite spells that paladins typically get access to. If you were planning for your weapon to grant spells that take an action to cast, this is a great way to replicate that. For example, if you're going to give a magic bow that would let them cast Fireball once per day, instead, after hitting with an arrow, they can create a smaller fireball around the target, just as a part of that attack. You keep the same feel, but you're building it into the attack action and making it feel a bit smoother for the players involved. No matter what utility options you give with the magic weapon, Keep in mind that the more times per day the player can use it, the weaker it should be. Also, try to limit yourself to 1 or 2 different utility things. You don't want to make an entire, class feat tree for your magic weapon. You want to keep it relatively simple. And with that, you have some good examples of combat utility your magic weapon can provide, which brings us to our last step, out of combat utility. This doesn't need to be anything particularly powerful. What you're going for is something small that will keep your players using their weapon even when they're not in combat. It can be as simple as lighting up as a torch or vibrating when it points north. Neither of these are very powerful at all, but they give your players an excuse to be using their weapon outside of a fight, which is going to make them more attached to it and will make it a more core part of their toolkit. If you want a little bit more power here, you can also give out of combat spells, like see invisibility or something like that isn't super useful in a fight, but outside of combat opens up a lot of doors. As a general note, if you follow these steps for creating a magic weapon, it should require attunement. This is going to make slightly stronger magic weapons that are more useful in a wider range of areas, so attunement is appropriate. Before we end the video, I just want to go over some tips for building weapons for players who like to dual wield, because it can be a little bit trickier. What you're going to do is follow the exact same steps that we established in this video, but treat the pair of weapons as a single weapon for all of it. For damage bonus, give each of them the same damage bonus, but maybe change the type of damage if you want to be a little bit more fun. For combat utility, give each one a single option and share the charges between them so they each have their own choice, but you're getting the same number of charges per day that a single weapon would get. For out of combat utility, just something small that requires both weapons is perfect. Finally, you're going to want to make the weapons share an attunement slot. This way your player can actually dual wield without using 2/3 of their attunement slots just on weapons. If you do this, it shouldn't be any more powerful than a single weapon, but still allow your player to play the way they want to. Also, as a quick note, any abilities that you give this pair of weapons shouldn't use the bonus action, because if you're doing the 2-weapon fighting style, you need that bonus action to make your extra attack. And with that, we're done. You now know some common weapon making pitfalls that you'll want to avoid and have a pretty easy 3-step process for making interesting, mechanically useful magic weapons. If you have any questions, or if you just want to show off a magic weapon you created, please leave a comment. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by the Arcanum and have a good day.